Hi everyone, welcome. Regulars on my channel know that this position here, top left on the shelf, is where we keep the oldest of my stuff, and then there's a pattern by which we get to the newer things off to the right. But here on the left, we've got my oldest system at 280 days of age. It's the oldest type of system that has the intention of being ended. Harvest the castings, move the worms on to a new location. Other systems are kind of perpetual by design, so I do have one of those systems too, but that one I'm not counting as being the oldest of my systems, although technically it is. Of the ones that have a finite lifespan, this is the oldest at 280 days of age. That's 40 weeks. The system's been, let's see, its claim to fame is that the previous home that these worms lived in was Outdoor Worm Bag version 5.0. And 40 weeks ago must have been when we finally bought an end to that system and launched those little guys into here. And then over the course of 18 feedings, this was the system that we were doing all the pocket feedings in, going from corner to corner to corner to corner. And at the very end of that, perhaps 4.5 times around, we fed here, and then we fed here, and it was right after those 2 feedings that we also kind of made the decision to sort of transition into a pattern where the feedings just continue to happen over on this edge. And over the past 2 feedings that followed those last 2 corner feedings, we've been continuing to feed on this edge, and today I'm guessing that we're probably ready to haul worms out. And with that in mind, I followed through on a little bit of homework that I gave myself last time we checked in on those little guys, which was to prepare a new home for them, and that's what you see out here on my bench. Number one is a freshly built bin here with perhaps a little bit of surplus bedding material in there that we could use for, number one, for a attempt at running a breeding bin. I'm going to try that. And then if we feel that the castings in the 280-day-old system still might have worms in them, we could use a little bit of bedding to build up ourselves a bait box with which we can try to lure out the stragglers. So I'm going to get a glove on and we're going to get to work. Setup of the bait box is going to be optional, but the setup of the new worm bin for the little guys, as well as a breeding bin, is definitely part of the plan. So now in the past, it was quite some time ago when I last attempted systems that were designed for breeding, and I think I made a couple mistakes. I don't want to really rehash it too much, but I figured since we had a nice preparation of bedding over here that's been soaking, perhaps even, yeah, look at that, there's standing water down in there. I don't know if you could see it from where you're at, but yeah, I tried to set the camera up to wide angle here temporarily while we're working on the setup of these systems. You know, I bet you if we were to simply turn all of this stuff around, some of this drier stuff on the material on the surface would be in contact with some of that standing water right below and possibly suck up a good bit of it. So I suppose I should probably take a peek under the hood once in a while before rolling the camera so that we don't have to spend time on certain things. But I kind of like the whole approach that I take where I don't really spoil the surprise for myself either. So a lot of times, almost all the time, when you guys are seeing something, it's me seeing it for the first time too. Although, you know, once in a while I do prepare for videos by checking in on bins the night before, but very little of that sort of stuff ever occurs. Almost everything that I do ends up becoming the basis for a video and for some discussion. So that right there, I suppose, can soak for a minute or two, or maybe we'll just start hijacking some of the material from it so that we can set up our breeding system. And this might be actually just what the doctor ordered, because number one, the material you use to build a breeding system does have to be quite damp, and the stuff that's been sitting at the bottom of that standing water that we just turned up is within easy reach, is probably just what the doctor ordered for the setup of a breeding environment. So last time I tried breeding environment, I did it in my yellow buckets, which don't have this much surface area for the worms to cruise out on. A bucket, the bottom of a bucket is what, maybe a quarter of this as far as surface area goes. And that was just me attempting to take the measurements that I had heard about, which I believe was 1 gallon of bedding material for each 100 adult worms. So I created environments in those buckets, which included a gallon, but that takes you up about, almost a quarter of the way in the bucket to get that gallon of bedding material in there. And then you've got a lot of depth. And then a little research I did watching other worm farmers videos on YouTube and stuff, I learned that you don't want to give them a lot of depth. You want to maintain a very shallow environment for breeding, and that would not allow the worms to be sort of like ships in the night, missing one another when there could have been an opportunity for an encounter. And the whole idea of that is that the encounters are going to result in worm cocoons and, in the end, a greater number of little wormies. So we're almost at the point where I believe we want to be, and it's perhaps the shallowest bin I've ever built. But this was exactly what I wanted. And just really quick before we get beyond the point of being able to look at this bin over here, I should have probably talked about it earlier, has holes on the bottom which would allow for the drainage of excess moisture, and I really wanted to go almost overboard by perhaps even checking in on here almost on a daily or maybe at least every other day to even add more moisture, whether or not it looks like they need it or not, and then have this as a place for it to drip down into if it becomes too much. But I really wanted it to be almost on the too wet side. And yeah, this container got melted, but I was able to salvage it. And as far as food goes, I guess there will be opportunities over the next few days or weeks while this system's in service to experiment with different variations. So one example that I saw that I really liked over on the Captain Matt channel was where the foods were laid out in a very specific pattern right on the surface, which was intended to be the places where the worms would be coming up, and after partaking in a yummy meal of worm foods, possibly spend a little time socializing with other worms, and then whatever happens happens. And maybe even at this point, I'm not sure if grit plays much of a role in this whole thing of a mating environment, but let's throw some of that in here anyway. So that's the basic ingredients for the environment. And into this approximately maybe a gallon worth of material, if that's what we've succeeded in placing in here, we're going to just recruit a number of adult worms. So the majority of the worms, though, will be placed into this larger container, which still has standing water on the bottom of it, which I've had actually happen on a couple occasions in a couple of my newer systems. Perhaps I just went a little bit overboard on the preparation of the system for the worms and dumped a little bit too much moisture in here, and it never really soaked in, but there'll be time for it to soak in short order. So I have a everything bagel which was completely rock hard, totally dried out, and it's been soaking in water in the hopes that it can soften up enough to be usable by the worms as a food substance. I can still feel a little piece of dry in the very middle of a couple of these chunks that hasn't soaked through yet, but all the material surrounding it is totally soaked, so those little pieces that are still dry are going to definitely going to soak through momentarily, I'm sure. And to balance out the starch-rich bagel down in the middle, I'm going to throw in a little bit of banana And let's not forget the things we sprinkled into the breeder bin, the grit, and even the worm chow will all come in pretty useful over here, I believe. So the environments are set, I believe, for the most part, for us to release the majority of the gathered worms in the 280-day-old system to be released into their new home over here. And before we do that, we'll be recruiting 100 or so mature adult worms to go into the lovely striped breeding bin. Lucky them. So let's reorganize a few things here and get started on getting the worms hauled out. Woo-hoo, that should be fun. So now here we've got all the bells and whistles when it comes to setting up a migration, right down to the perforated cardboard divider, showing us where the finished castings are on one side and where the feeding zone, the quote-unquote horizontal migration feeding zone, are relative to each other. Previously we had just sort of set up the feeding zone on that edge on the horizontal migration feeding zone side without a perforated cardboard divider, but during the last check-in we kind of made it official. And I guess the main purpose of that, in my mind, my reason for doing that, is that it feels like it's definitely going to result in a clearer distinction between where the nice finished castings end and then where the rest of the action takes off. So I guess I'm trying not to blend in a whole bunch of this stuff here. It's the reason I'm kind of going right there along the edge of the division of the horizontal migration feeding zone at the partition to the finished castings, and I'm thinking this is the ideal time to really pick out anything that doesn't really belong in what you would want to consider to be your finished castings. I'm already obviously getting worms in the quote-unquote finished castings, but as long as they're occupied still by worms, it seems to me like we're going to need some time to let this stuff finish off anyway, although on that far edge it does seem like we've got a minimal amount of worms. But it is always easiest just to take into account the fact that you're most likely going to have worms in your castings that you're already on the brink of considering as harvested and finished. But I myself am typically not in any sort of an urgent need for the castings to be completely done, so I can typically just put them into storage and let them sit around for a while and mature prior to being used. So for me, letting stuff sit around so that any lingering little bits that are still in it can further break down, that's always another place where I can count on stuff that makes its way into the finished castings to be broken down. That is, of course, if I choose not to screen this stuff. So that's really what I've ended up doing in the past few cases when I've pretty much brought a system to an end and managed to complete the depopulation of the material. I've just thrown the stuff into buckets and not worried about it. I didn't go through the process of screening it to try to get any sort of little lingering bits of food or debris out of it. I just took it on fate that that stuff that might still be in it will actually serve a beneficial function in storage to provide the fungi and the bacteria and any, who knows, maybe even some straggler wormies that were either left behind in this stuff or perhaps even, who knows, were born in this stuff, because perhaps a number of cocoons were left behind. So that's kind of right there what I'm going to consider to be the harvested castings from this system, but we're going to not treat it as such yet. We'll be building up the bait box and deploying it into this material. You know, I've got examples of that happening, other videos of it, In a few occasions more recently, I've done it like this, where I've just left the decision to deploy it or not to now, and then just came back off camera and set it up. Look at this cardboard's really holding up very, very nicely. How do you like that? I mean, this would almost even suggest that if we wanted to, we could just set up another horizontal migration feeding zone and continue with just migrating the worms out of their castings versus setting up a bait box. I don't know. Perhaps I've got to toss a coin and decide which approach to use. So, I've been using, in the past, a box approximately this size to do my haul outs, but it just seems way too small. So that box is really just a stand now onto which I place this considerably larger container, into which we're going to empty the horizontal migration feeding zone, and this is the worm population that's going to help us launch off the new system today. So I do like the idea of keeping all this bedding type stuff a little bit off on the side, out of the way here, so we can actually look at what we're dealing with here as far as the worm population, because I'm definitely treating the finished casting side as still having worms in it. I'm not leaving any of them behind, so they still count too. But as far as the what I would consider to be probably the majority of the population of this system is probably all right here, and I really wanted to make sure that I had provided them with ample space to live in. Since the center of attention is off camera, we better account for that before we make a major filming error here. I'll get the whole job done. I'll go back to reviewing the footage, then I'll realize I never slid anything over into view of the camera. But here we go. Hauling out the gathered worms. 11 days since we came in here to add more food to the horizontal migration feeding zone. Prior to that, there had been 14 days, so technically 25 days of this edge getting fed edge to edge. Not to mention the 2 previous pocket feedings that occurred over on this edge as well. So this system's been getting worms coaxed over to this side for a really long time now. So here we've got kind of more right down the middle, and many, 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 many more worms coming with that handful right there. I think the stuff that we threw in there last time into the horizontal migration feeding zone were just your typical fairly fast composting type foods. But the one thing that we bumped into is what I'm finding already right here is what was left of an apple fed the time prior. And there is definitely a good bit of apple remaining here, considering it goes back 2 feedings. Well, maybe not. Maybe what I'm seeing there is actually just a whole bunch of worms, not even the apple itself. So, man, look at all these worms. And I think we've only hauled out about half of this horizontal migration feeding zone. It almost makes me wonder if we would have been better off preparing to launch 2 systems with these little guys. Well, I think we're going to be okay. They're going to be appreciative of a whole bunch of nice fresh bedding to be moved into, to make themselves at home in. But yeah, you can definitely see that there's lots and lots of wormies over here. So this little pile around the apple, that's pretty cool, or the worms that were around the apple. That was pretty exciting. Just amazing. The apple definitely drew a huge crowd, and it was doing what you expect from apples, just taking forever to break down, to get consumed. But it definitely accounted for a couple fun check-ins for us to sort of barge in on them while they're working on it and see a little spectacle of a worm party happening. But I think, number one, we've still got stragglers to contend with. And it's for that reason, since I know I'm going to be dealing with that I'm not going to sweat it too much in terms of trying to pick out every last worm. I'm going to go into this knowing full well that we've still got work to do here, whether we set up horizontal migration again over here and continue again with just trying to move them out that way. Might not be a bad idea. I've got the bait box, but you know what? I believe that that's just something I'm going to have to surprise you guys with, because I'm going to do that off camera after I finish and not force myself into deciding on how to play that one. And let's just make sure we don't have any other stragglers on my glove. Yeah, so the recruitment of adult worms from this system is still pending though. So I think before we just release these little guys into their new home, I think we do need to find the worms that we're going to choose to be our subjects in the breeding environment. So let's not forget, but I've got to get a transport container into which we can put those little guys. So give me a moment and I'll be right back. We'll take care of that next. So we'll use our trusty container here to gather up the lucky 100 or so worms that are going to be used to start up our breeding environment. But I had this idea, if we're able to find it. Yeah, I believe this right here is actually what remains of the apple. It seems like the worms have skedaddled. They didn't like the disruption. There's still a few of them on there, but I figured, what the heck, let's keep the apple with the breeders, because they do seem pretty charged up when they're around that, and they've been eating it for a few weeks now, so it's definitely familiar stuff. So, you know, I guess I could go through these and look at them each individually. Yeah, it's got a full-size, what is it, the bulge on their body, clitellum, I believe it's called. So the clitellum on the red wiggler is just the indicator that the worm has reached the age of maturity where it is capable of breeding. And here and there I definitely see myself picking up a little flimsy, skinny baby worm, perhaps attached to the larger one that I'm reaching for here. So, you know, I don't think it really takes all that long for a worm to reach mating age, maturity. So even if I'm grabbing a few that are still juvenile and not yet even old enough to participate in the grand experiment that we're lining up for them here, then they will be soon. So let's just grab another handful of stuff from down low. The spot over where that chunk of apple was did seem to be a pretty good spot, but it does seem like every handful, you know, yields a huge pile of lively, shiny, active, healthy looking worms, basically. And you know, I really made absolutely no effort to keep track of how many worms I've recruited so far. And it even makes me wonder if 100 is even the right number to go with. I thought it was 100 worms per 1 gallon of bedding, and I really wanted to keep the amount of bedding in mind to a minimum. Even the number of worms, I was satisfied with a fairly small number, just because I'd like to see the process in action. I'd like to see it working, you know. It is pretty exciting when you watch one of these videos where they check to see how many cocoons have, you know, been produced over a certain amount of time, and then they go through this stuff and they just see cocoons everywhere. So I'm really hoping that that's kind of what we end up with. I don't know, do we have 100? Did I manage to eventually recruit 100 worms while I was busy yapping? It almost seems to me like if we were to just grab another little pile of worms like that almost for certain has to account for enough worms for us to start out with at least 100. I'll bet you there's way more than 100 in here. So I usually don't, you know, I usually don't run breeding systems, and in breeding systems you are kind of going for a fairly puny number of worms, just so there's, I don't know, I guess you don't get that instinct from the worms making them feel like they're already in an overcrowded space. They want to feel like there's plenty of room to grow their population, and I think that's one of the key ingredients. So let's let these little guys settle in, and then we can proceed to the next phase of releasing the rest of the population into their new home. So I don't know if adding any sugary goodness to their environment is going to help or hurt things, but I've got these old, or really old, gummy bears. So I figure we'd drop a few of those in. And before we cover up, I thought we might even just grab a few pieces of this bedding material that had been in their horizontal migration feeding zone and perhaps just treat them to at least a few scraps of that too. Some familiar bedding type material to cozy up to should you find the brand new environment to be whatever, uncomfortable. Hopefully that's not the case. So I've got nice top coverings here. We've got one piece of paper, which I didn't really even take into account the fact that it's dry, and that kind of goes against the whole idea that we've been trying to promote here, which is high degree of dampness for the breeding environment. So I believe this is once again a nice opportunity for me to return some of this lovely goodness that's on my gloves to a worm environment. And might seem like a lot of moisture, but I doubt the worms are going to mind. I think they're going to really enjoy it, and then we're going to provide a fairly thorough top covering onto this system so that the majority, if not all the moisture that's in here can remain in it. It does seem like we're able to go all the way out to the edges, and it's even adhering to the damp plastic wall, so it does seem like we've got almost no breathing room. And you know what? Besides that, nice translucent covering, but I'd almost prefer to even provide them with more opportunities to meet and mate, so we'll give them some shade as well. So that's it for the breeding system, but let's get on to the main event. That's what we really want to see, right? Let's go. Alright, let's be fair. Let's throw a few of these into the new worm bin too, but well, it's a lot less gummy bear to go around. And as far as releasing these wormies, we're gonna stick to the script that I usually follow, which is to turn to you guys, the viewers. I'm really looking forward to hearing from everyone, because it's at this time I'll usually turn to my viewers to provide me with a comment letting me know how many worms are thought to have been released into the system here. So I'm just going to throw some of this bedding material that was top coverings or whatever it was, part of the feeding zone, horizontal migration feeding zone. Get this stuff out of the mix. If the worms dive down, they're going to encounter that nice friendly familiar material, not to mention all this nice friendly familiar material coming along for the ride with them. So let's not delay any longer. Here and there a couple little worms just getting a little advanced entry into the new home, but let's just make it official. Let's let these little guys loose now. I always get nervous. I hope I'm not going to spill the whole thing all over the place and make a big mess, and I will try to let's do it this way. I'll try to move the material around so that everyone can get a good look at it before the worms dive down out of view. And then hopefully everyone will provide a comment letting me know how many worms they believe we've just launched this new system off with. So really quick, before I pull away and give these guys some peace, let's do what we mentioned a moment ago, which is just to spread them out. Wow. This is going to be a very heavily populated worm bin. Alright, I could probably pour through this material even more and come up with some huge, dense handfuls of wormies to show you, but I think this kind of gives you an idea of what we're dealing with here. We've got ourselves a nice, heavily populated worm bin. Let's let these little guys settle in, and then we'll be almost done. Alright, so for these little guys too, I've got a prepared top covering, And on top of that can go this nice sheet of plastic to enable the system to hang on to its moisture content. You'll remember this was pretty much a swamped bin with standing water in it. I don't know if turning things around and submerging the dry stuff down into that resulted in it getting sopped up, maybe. Maybe not. Perhaps there's even more standing water still in here for the worms to take a little splash in if they wish to. But I don't think that'll last. I think the worms will make use of that. It'll just get blended in everywhere. So that makes it official. We've got ourselves a nice new red wiggler worm bin all set to go. But you know what? There's one last thing. And I think some of you know what that is. So let's make sure we take care of business and then we'll be done. So now, ladies and gentlemen, in keeping with tradition, I invite you to join me in welcoming our two newest systems here. The breeder bin up here on top. I don't know, I've got a rough number. I mentioned how I was hoping to deploy about 100 worms into that one gallon or so material. I think I might have gone over a little bit, so I'd love to hear everyone's guesses as far as how many worms were released into each of these systems. And as far as this production red wiggler bin over here, man, this system's got a lot of worms in it. And I've already got a little number formulating in my head, but I'm really looking forward to hearing what all you guys have to say about that. So please don't forget to leave me a quick comment. Let me know how many worms were deployed into these two systems. And I'll be looking forward to gathering up all of our information and averaging them. That's what we usually end up doing with our information. We average the guesses, and then we come up with a pretty cool, hopefully accurate estimate of the population sizes. So that's it for the video, everyone. I've got a few things to take care of as far as getting stuff cleaned up, put away, but I'm not going to waste your time with that. That's boring. Before I go really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.